The Summer of Psilocytes, Part 4, The Devil in the Details. It was mid-August when I set off north toward the cottage residence of James, my friend who I first consumed Mycospawn with. It seemed right to have my most powerful dose yet with the guy who had introduced me to the great unknown in the first place. James had dropped out of Forest University after his sophomore year, equally disenchanted with how his friendships had gone, as he was with the hawkish nature of academia. He had figured out that he wanted to be a farmer, and he could learn how to do that without the university's help. Rashid told me that James was quite social his freshman year when they roomed together at Forest, but a lot of his sociability had revolved around an excess of power consumption. I'm not one to judge, nor do I even know the extent of what actually happened, but he more or less constantly consumed green power for his entire 2 years at uni. Again, this isn't too different from what I've exhibited myself, but there are different degrees of even what most would consider quote-unquote excessive green power consumption, and due to the forgiving nature of the power, it's easy for the lines to remain blurred. I'm even more in the dark about the extent to which James had made communion with Psilocytes, and likewise, how strongly he had connected to DSL. During that time, I know Rashid wasn't around every time James blasted himself into the great unknown with some gang of eclectic Forest psychonauts he didn't know well. Not that doing so in itself is negative in consequence, but I know well enough now the possible consequences of consuming certain powers in the company of practical strangers. What I mean to say is that I hadn't really seen James for 2 years, and only had vague ideas of what had happened at Forest University. From what I could tell, he had become a seasoned power user who now only wanted to live off of the land, and thus had dropped out of academia to get a head start on his own modest farm operation. When I arrived to his place, he showed me the farm right away, which, however modest in size, exhibited plenty of hours of effort. He had put a solid amount of work into growing a variety of plants. He grew organic green beans, watermelons, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, and just about every other vegetable. There were also chickens, a few cows, and a donkey living on the farm. There were people who lived in a bigger house on the property who rented his cabin out to him, and he had a relationship to them unknown to me. He welcomed me warmly as ever and showed me around his one-room cabin. It had a futon, a loft with 2 twin beds, a stove, a sink, and a composting toilet out back. I liked the place and could see how this simpler way of life was appealing to him. On his table sat a big bowl of stones, gems, and crystals, all of which were beautiful and fascinating in their own ways. I took James for a gem expert, knowledgeable about a variety of stones and their properties, whereas I primarily focused on my love for lapis lazuli. The way I looked at it, lapis lazuli was at least a nice talisman to direct positive energy to, and at most, a throat chakra opening, third eye empowering gem with divine chemistry, worth utilizing. I didn't know what exactly James knew or thought, but I assumed that he had a more nuanced approach to his bowl of gems. For certain, I knew he loved moldavite, the glassy jade-coloured gem from space with unique energies worth absorbing. It was hard to tell if I could really feel the energy of the moldavite in my hand versus any other stone, because even if I thought I could for even just a moment, it was hard to tell how much it had to do with James's suggestions versus an objectively existent energy presence. "Doesn't it feel so much heavier? Can't you feel it?" James would say, in hopes that I'd jump aboard. Moldavite was at least beautiful to look at, I figured. I was a heady man myself, but James was perhaps an even headier man, and I hadn't made some of the ideological leaps he had yet. Sure, I felt the lapis lazuli to possibly be in special union with me, and thus had integrated it into my style and general philosophies. but I had the feeling that James had developed a series of complex relationships with his different stones. I speculated that he was perhaps in an energetic league that I was not. Moreover, James was a strong believer in certain theories that concerned UFOs as well as various conspiracies, including, but not limited to, the existence of lizard people and the Illuminati. He didn't operate in a paranoid manner about it, but rather thought certain things were entirely possible, and probably true, because there was no good way to prove otherwise. That was a sticky suspicion to enter my brain. The idea that we have no way of really proving whether shape-shifting entities are operating amongst us right now disguised as humans, but I knew better than to believe in it fully and to operate based on such a wild idea. All esoteric and paranoid subjects of interest aside, James was a kinder than average green power enthusiast who cultivated his own supply of the stuff at a high level. Deciding to consume green power together after school back in the day and share thought-provoking discussions was practically how we became friends, and that foundation still rang true. After he showed me around his farm, we chatted over some green power and cooked a delicious dinner that consisted of vegetables from his garden and a locally sourced pork shoulder. I wish I could remember what we talked about that night, because it was a pleasant rekindling of friendship. I believe I showed him the penis envies we were to consume the next day. He was impressed with their size and remarked that they were sure to be powerful Mycospawn indeed. We drank a couple barley drinks and went to our separate sleeping quarters early enough. It felt similar to going to bed on Christmas Eve, knowing that the next day would be life-changing to some extent, and probably in a positive way. We got up promptly and cooked a delicious breakfast of eggs and some more of the pig from the night before. I feel the need to go over what we ate, because I now believe that one's diet before a Mycospawn consumption plays a role in the experience. We ate the breakfast quickly, eager to get closer to the point of Mycospawn consumption. Before consuming, we decided to go buy some dark chocolate down the street first, so that we could melt it and coat the penis envies. This was my idea, because I'd never had chocolate with Mycospawn before, and I looked forward to how it would mask the funky Mycospawn taste. We melted the dark Hershey's bar in a Pyrex cooking tray and proceeded to submerge our Mycospawn doses. They ended up tasting better for sure, but the flavour was still not completely masked. Turned out there was a bit of a funk to these envies that not even chocolate could flush out. I decided to go through with my plan of an A-level experience, but James advised against it. Even though he had not tried this batch, he thought they were definitely too powerful for a full A-level experience, so he was going to go with an A-. I told him that the difference was probably so subtle that he might as well do the full A with me, but he stayed firm in his assessment that he would not consume more than an A-. It was clear to him that these Mycospawn possessed much more power than the standard strain. So I went with the full A-level dose against his advice, and he happily consumed his A-. After we consumed the Mycospawn, we decided to go down to the river just behind James's cabin, separated only by tall grasses and a line of trees. It was an ideal upper 70s summer day, and James raved about the local wildlife we might see. I spaced out at the passing butterflies as we proceeded down the path toward the river, and I couldn't stop uttering nervous laughter. I found myself in true trepidation regarding what would be the most powerful experience of my life. The visual field was still normal as far as I could tell, though I wondered if the trees were always that droopy. As we came to an opening on the bank of the river, we found that it was rocky and muddy, and James warned me to not get stuck in the mud. Right as he said that, my Birkenstock got stuck in the mud, and I had to pull it out against much suction. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but what a bad omen it was to get stuck in the mud. even if just for a moment. I decided I'd leave my Birkenstocks and my chrysocolla necklace at a spot near the entrance to the bank so that they wouldn't get lost. Chrysocolla was my second-tier gem in a way, wrapped in copper wire and entwined with a forest green hemp necklace. I wore it to promote good social energy and luck, so I thought. We made our way to a fallen tree in a drier region of the rocks and sat down by the river. The sun drenched me in a layer of sweat as flies buzzed around my head. I felt light-headed with the classic butterfly stomach of a Mycospawn come-up and was sure I was approaching a higher frequency. My ears rang a little bit, and I felt the need to hunch over the fallen tree and close my eyes as a coping mechanism. "Look at that cloud," James interjected. I looked up at the lone cloud in the sky, and it appeared as a skiff of heads and faces, as if the faces that jutted out were the surface of an oval-shaped wheel. It was just as intriguing and impressive as the faces I had encountered on other Mycospawn experiences, but my body load continued to grow in intensity. It was amazing, but I was still awfully queasy. Then I looked across the river and saw these black, deer-looking shadow animals. They had no details other than their sharp outlines, something I would expect to see in cave paintings. I tried to ignore them, because I found them to be frightening. A collective coming towards me with no cues of intent, only their dark forms. I thought that perhaps this was the visual component of dark spirits approaching, whether on the astral plane, in the subconscious, or in the great unknown nexus. I could pick my poison with that one, because there was no way of really knowing anything anymore at that point. I closed my eyes in retreat again, when suddenly a deity-like form started to appear. It looked like a classic skinny Buddhist statue, but instead of sitting cross-legged, it stood on one foot, while the other foot pressed against the side of its knee. The closest thing I can relate it to is Shiva, the destroyer, standing on one foot, with the other crossing over, arms splayed out. The main difference was that this Shiva had a Hindu demon head, wide-eyed and sharp-toothed, with its tongue shooting out. This image came through as an outline of fire filled with darkness, as if I was on the inside of some dark hollow container, while a deity-shaped branding iron was slowly being applied from the outside, the glow of its shape brighter and brighter as it was pressed. I opened my eyes in avoidance of what I considered to be dark imagery, and James pointed out a frog in the river that held onto a submerged little branch. It waved like a flag, being blown by the current of the river. I like frogs well enough, and thought that this was perhaps a positive turn for my rocky come-up with Psilocytes. I spoke up in a nervous jest, and in a poorly done Russell Brand-sounding accent I had toyed with upon becoming recently obsessed. "Oh, I'm sure frogs can talk. 'Ello there, frog. Can't you speak?" I said stupidly. The frog seemed to stare at me, and my nausea resurfaced. James laughed. "Look, he's holding on for dear life," James said with childlike excitement. Sure enough, the current gave the frog some force to deal with. This frog was indeed holding on for dear life, or at least against a quick drift downriver. All at once I became aware of my bodily position, and noticed that I was hunched over a log of driftwood, also quote-unquote, holding onto a branch for dear life, as I faced the sheer power of Psilocytes pulling me into the great unknown. The frog let go of the branch and flew immediately out of sight. After I processed the parallel symbolism I couldn't ignore, I got up in a hurry and told James I felt like I was going to puke. "If you're going to puke, go over there," he said calmly, though he was visibly concerned. I walked away from him and quickly started to feel better in my stomach, but realised that I couldn't find my Birkenstocks and necklace I had left somewhere to keep safe. What a rookie move that was. I started to worry that the mud had somehow swallowed them up. As soon as I thought that, though, I found them right where I'd left them, of course. How much longer until I lost something else? I returned to James and suggested that we go back to the cabin so that I could feel more comfortable. We had just stayed in the sun during the heat of the day, and I was muddy and disoriented. As we walked back to his cabin through the field, I started to worry that people had seen us there and knew what was up, meaning they somehow knew that we had consumed some Mycospawn. I realized that we had consumed green power by the river at some point as well, but I couldn't remember at which point. This got me wondering what else could have happened to me that I had simply missed due to my intoxication. For all I knew, the cars that drove over the bridge near the river could have seen us and instantly known that we had consumed illegal substances. I heard helicopters and cars in the distance, and a new feeling grew that the police were coming to get us. It didn't help that James looked every which way as we walked back to the cabin, as if watching out for predators on the prowl. As his display of paranoia elevated my own, I heard women laugh and say, "Oh my God," in Valley Girl voices. I was later informed that there were no such voices in the distance, and it was indeed an auditory trick from Psilocytes himself. The tall grass around us swayed every which way and appeared to grow before my eyes. Powerful winds were stirring, and I reckoned that we had committed some level of Mycospawn consumption that had resulted in a stronger consequence than we could have anticipated. As soon as we entered the cabin, instead of feeling relieved that I was in private safety away from the outside world, I immediately had the sense that something had gone wrong. I became convinced that the police were on their way to pick us up right there and then. There was no longer any way to feel safe. I told James that I felt like they knew about me and all of the bad things I'd done. James asked me what I meant by bad things, and I nervously laughed as I clarified that by bad things I only meant bad according to the law, such as powers. There also loomed this possibility that our green power consumption by the river was observed and thus known to the authorities. I started to explain to James that I needed to leave because I simply didn't feel safe there, and also I needed to see my mum, which instantly felt embarrassing considering I was the adult age of 19. James hurriedly rejected my idea of leaving, and rightfully so. He needed no more than the reason of us being only 1 hour into an A-level Mycospawn experience with penis envies, so we were clearly in a state unfit for driving. He reminded me that I didn't know my way back to the highway from his place anyway, because he had directed me there via phone before, and I didn't have a phone with GPS. In what felt like an extreme measure, he took my phone and keys and told me that it was my technology that was doing me no good. If I wanted to have a better experience, I needed to be free from technology. While that was based on good intentions on his part, suddenly I felt like it was but one step in an effort to remove me from the grid, to steal me from my old life forever. The logic made no sense, since James had been one of my greatest friends from my high school days, but I just didn't believe he was him anymore. Perhaps he had fallen into a brand of rugged libertarianism after his first year of college, and was now someone who would make a drastic judgment call about whether I should return to my old life in society. The more I tried to escape with verbal efforts, the less patient he got with my unwillingness to accept the no keys and phone ultimatum. He asked me why I had come to see him, if all I wanted to do was leave. I admitted that I didn't realize that I would become so scared. "This just isn't good, Steverino, this just isn't good. Something really bad is happening right now. This is a bad journey into the great unknown," James said glumly. He anxiously paced in the tiny cabin as he wondered aloud about what to do with me. First, he decided I needed to find a way to relax, so he had me follow him up to his loft to rest on one of the 2 twin beds while he rested on the other. I tried to rest, but ultimately found myself unable to because I still didn't trust him. His new persistence with wanting me to lie down made me think he was possibly trying to be gay with me, even though we were in separate beds and he exhibited no such desires. All at once, as if I had connected the dots in a way I had been unable to before, I suspected that he wanted to keep me in his cabin forever, to be his sex slave. What a terrifying conclusion it was. Maybe that was the conspiracy of this whole scenario, this whole let's eat Mycospawn in the middle of the woods together thing. Because I understood the narrative to be that James desired homosexual relations, I tried to steer him away from that direction, and in an awkwardly faux masculine tone asked him if there were any women around there. He looked startled and amused before he replied. Women? Really? He almost laughed. Yeah. Is there something wrong with that? I said, a little too frustrated. No, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, there might be some around, James responded unenthusiastically. I made a bro-ish expression of approval, like a drawn-out nice, and James replied that I should probably continue to lie down. No, man, I'm done with this. I'm going home, I said, as I started down the ladder from the loft. He appeared defeated and confused, but I vaguely reassured him that I just had to go because I didn't feel good. I also repeated the need to see my mum. Annoyed, he asked me why I had to do that. Because she always tells me when everything's okay, I said innocently. He rolled his eyes. Steverino, Steverino, Steverino. You have so much to learn. You have to let go of all of that. You don't need your mom right now, he said disappointedly. I knew that made sense, and I wanted to believe it, but it still didn't make me feel better, and it still felt like he was trying to make me reject my former life. In a sort of fight or flight, I shouted at him to give me my keys back, to which he firmly refused, for the same perfectly understandable reasons. I asked him if I could at least have my phone, and after a moment, he reluctantly agreed, only because it didn't have any service out there anyways. He was right. Not only did it not have service, but every time I tried to type a text, it would turn into pure gibberish, as if my knowledge of letters was no longer real or relevant. I was overcome with a strong sense of powerlessness and fear. I relayed my fear to James and earnestly asked him if everything was okay. He said yes, but I didn't believe him because he didn't look like everything was okay. Then I asked him a few times in a row what was wrong with him, and he reassured me over and over that there was definitely nothing wrong with him. Eventually, my prodding irritated him, and he told me to stop. He told me that I really just needed to shut up when it came down to it. This gave me a conspiratorial sense that he was trying to minimize my questioning in order to maintain control, which he was in a way, but I thought it was because there was a secret agenda I was only then becoming all too aware of. I told him I wanted to leave again, and he told me to try and see how that goes. He went outside and sat on the porch swing, where he invited me to hang and relax for a second, but I couldn't dismiss my negative suspicions. Just like that, I ended up in a vicious thought loop. The loop went as follows. I would walk out onto the porch and see James, ask where my phone was, walk back inside, look for my phone in my backpack, not find it, and repeat. Eventually, in that loop, I found my phone in my backpack and couldn't understand why it wasn't there the countless times before. It didn't really matter though, since I still couldn't type real words on it, and it still didn't have service. This loop of mental processes and physical actions led me to believe I was stuck inside my mind, in some mental experience loop, severed from reality, and was thus most likely no longer alive. Through some level of irrational reasoning, I became convinced that I couldn't go home because home no longer existed. I figured I must have died down at the river, but had been tripping too hard to realize it, or was rather spared the painful details by the mercy of the great unknown. That was the reason for the helicopter noises, the cars, and the girls commenting. I had died at the river, whether from drowning, seizures, or anything else to do with losing my mind, and cars had pulled over to investigate. The scene had led to me being airlifted out, and as I was carried out on a stretcher, I had been witnessed by roadside valley girls who had exclaimed, "Oh my God." Yes, maybe all of that had happened, but also, maybe when one dies from too much penis envy mycospawn, one's mind is spared the dirty details and shipped straight into the afterlife. It turned out the afterlife for me was to be trapped on that farm and in that cabin for the rest of eternity. So who was James then? Well, my first thought was that he was a kind of Satan, or the reality of what all Satan or demon figures are meant to represent. Maybe everyone had their own personal Satan, and he was mine. I thought he was possibly an ancient, ageless shape-shifting being, there to collect my powerful soul amongst others. Another idea was that our lives might have happened like this before, and had been recurring for an infinite amount of time. It was the story of two souls reincarnating in each other's bodies, life after life, to learn the different lessons each incarnation had to offer. It was all possible to me, but the overwhelming impression was that James was a sadistic manipulator of consciousness, once he had others in the great unknown, whether a shapeshifter or not, but someone who had definitely trapped me and thrown me for a loop. I became increasingly less sure of what this thing I had called quote-unquote reality actually was. In a lot of ways, it seemed perfectly plausible that I could have been the one conscious human soul experiencing the grand delusion of the real world and its real people, when in fact it was just a digitized illusion packed with the automaton slaves of my evil counterpart. Everything I had known was all just playing a part to simulate a real life. It could have also have been a test for this incarnation of my soul, under a rule such as, "You will now be Steverino, and you will slowly learn that you love Mycospawn." When faced with the opportunity to take an A-level dose of penis envies, will you be smart and take the A- level with James, or will you take the full A-level dose and fall into the clutches of Satan himself? Do you think you can outsmart him, or have you just made the mistake of your life? The ideas involved a great deal of solipsism, no doubt, as if I could really be a whole half of a cosmic binary. A less self-centered theory was that James was but one of many ageless wizard and witch types that had existed since medieval times, and through some handshake with sorcery, he had achieved immortality and spent lifetimes preying on people with powerful souls. James could manipulate his victims into lowering their psychic defenses so that he could steal their souls and trap them in his gems and crystals. If that was the case, I was dealing with some seriously foreign phenomenon, and unfortunately I had thought myself brave for dwelling in the great unknown, when in reality it was a psychically dangerous thing to do. The great unknown was really where powerful astral beings dwelled and satisfied their own God-forsaken desires and needs. Worse yet, maybe James liked to make his gemstone captives his own personal sex slaves. My ultimate conclusion was that I had been swallowed up by a divine darkness, and this was a realm that I must at least try to escape. My hopes weren't high though, as I figured that the worst of this penis envy purgatory had yet to come. I tried to come up with logical ways to break out of the reality, as if I could just rip through it like paper and find my way back to the old one, but all I could think to do was run in place. I had reasoned, running in place as fast as you can will accelerate you back to the other dimension. But almost as soon as I started jogging in place, I realised I was merely stomping on James's floor. I was reminded that I really had no idea what I was doing, so I sighed heavily and even started to whimper in my helplessness. James felt bad for my suffering and offered me a hug. It seemed like a good idea, like it might be part of the way back to reality. But as I hugged him, I started to grow angry. Here was a man, or an unknown entity of some other sort, who pretended to feel sorry for me, when in fact, he was the one who smugly toyed with my stolen soul. I decided to give him a taste of his own medicine, and pinched his shoulder during our hug. "Ow!" he exclaimed, as he ended the hug suddenly. I thought, why not slap him in the face too? So I did. Enraged, he started to curse and shoved me onto the couch. In reality, he must have been pissed because there was nothing he could do. If he was nice to me, then I'd think it was a trap. And if he was mean, then it would play into my delusion of his evil even better. I just thought he was angry that I wasn't cooperating with his sadistic gay desires. "I can't believe you, Steverino," he shouted as he folded his arms. I decided violence probably wasn't the answer. James regained composure and calmly, yet firmly, told me again that what was happening definitely wasn't good, that I was clearly possessed by a demon and it needed to be cast out of me. Another trick, I figured. Another way James wanted to toy with me, to give me false hope that there was a way out. I thought that if I could just find the right key, whether it be an object, action, or thought, he would restore my life back, like a sphinx with a riddle. For example, I thought that if I called out his true identity, he would have no choice but to let me go. "You took away everything. You stole my soul," I started to sing in a playful, eerie tone. I sang some more basic lyrics about imprisonment, as if they were my own personal slave hymn, and this was a situation I'd been in for most of my life, rather than just a few hours. The singing seemed to disappoint him, and to me, that signaled that I was figuring it out and foiling his scheme. Eventually I stopped with the singing, because it stopped yielding any sort of reaction from him. If I really was in the devil's clutches, or experiencing some reality of the dying process, all I could do was go with the flow and accept the inevitable. That didn't really make it any less terrifying or bizarre, but at least I'd lost the false impression of having control. So I agreed to let him cast the demon out of me. He pulled out a stone wand, and it struck me that although I had seen those in New Age shops before, I had no idea what they were actually used for. I can't remember if I asked him, or if he just told me, but he said they were used for healing. However, he could not prove whether they were used specifically for demon extraction without trying to perform such on me. With my back on the floor, he took the stone wand and started rubbing it in different shapes on my chest. It felt like he turned my body into a metallic liquid portal into space, something that yielded some gravitational pull. At this point, I got the mental image of a snake eating its own tail, and I felt an epiphany strike me. The only way back was to swallow myself outside in, or as I quickly deduced, practically kill myself. As soon as I thought it, I realized I could never do it. It would simply hurt too much. I tried clenching my jaw aggressively and bit my bottom lip as a placeholder attempt, but it wouldn't budge. I'd only stop once I reached too much pain. James told me I only had to breathe to feel better, as he exaggerated breathing with drawn-out inhales and exhales. Great, I thought. Now he's taunting me with simple, calming exercises. But when I decided to follow his breathing rhythm, I heard my voice in addition to an accompanying breathing sound in my head that sounded more high definition or essential, like someone was breathing the universe's first primal breath in my ear. I identify that now as the first of a collection of natural or elemental embodiments I experienced while lying down. Next, James told me to drink water, which likewise made an internal noise like rushing water within me, until I had a flash memory of myself drowning, as if I had drowned earlier in the river. Confident in what evidence I had found, I knew it was time to ask James frankly. "James, did I drown in the river earlier?" I asked sadly, as if I knew the answer already. "This isn't good, Steverino," he said shortly without answering my question. Looking back, he could have just said something like, "No, dude, of course you didn't drown." But would I have believed him? It's hard to say. Anyway, I thought that I had drowned, and that the devil was unhappy with my lack of awareness of my own death. That's why he wouldn't tell me straight up that I had drowned. Water became one of many mental go-tos, or instances in my mind where I would look for the right embodiment key to escape from the hell I was in. Whenever the water feelings came up, I would only remember how they still didn't work, and I would resume my frenetic journey through other natural essences. The frenetic order of elemental sensations I experienced next is difficult to recall with perfect accuracy. Whatever it all was, it seemed to be a super blending of the senses, like synesthesia, but more like having all my senses linked to different universal Jungian archetypes. It was as if everything I could speak or think of had fundamental feelings, properties, energies, and personalities that could course through me as if I were a vessel. One of the sensory zones I entered was less specific and consisted of only a square in the top left corner of my closed eye vision. When I looked at it, I felt like I entered a glitch in thinking, like an error message on a computer that you can't X out of. And this was further validation that I was falling deeper into a black hole of death. No matter what progress I felt I made through my language or essence navigations, I would literally end up at square one with the square in the top left corner of the darkness. Then something more disturbing happened. My body went through a series of more or less involuntary movements. This included flailing my arms in the air, rolling my eyes backward, sticking my tongue out as far as possible, crossing my eyes, and even grabbing my crotch area. Not necessarily in that order, nor all at once, but that series of things happened in a short time span, and it reads like a demon extraction. Perhaps James's healing wand had worked, if I didn't know any better. I don't want to cry demon possession, but it fits in well with all the details of the story, and one can't really ignore the similarities between what I went through and what demon possession is thought to look like. Regardless of the objective truth of the matter, my body was pushed to its extremities of perception. There seemed to be no way out of the black hole. James suggested that I drink water again, something I figured hadn't worked before, with its ineffective wishy-washy sound. He decided to pour a little water on my face without warning, I guess because he figured it was a classic way to snap people out of whatever they were on about. Instead, it made for a great simulation of my apparent recent drowning, which I had adopted as a true narrative. I imagined a vision of the river spirit as she took me, like a glassy, clear, beautiful goddess with blue eyes, or so I hoped. Perhaps she wanted me to live with her in the river forever. But there again came the sounds of breathing from before, and new winds howled in my head and forced me to acknowledge what had been the wind spirit all along. The new breeze strangely brought with it a new essence, one of bug noises. Maybe I'd be reincarnated as an insect after I died there on the floor, I wondered. It felt juicy and gross to imagine what it'd be like to be a bug, such as a grasshopper or a cicada. Not that it wouldn't be cool in some way, but my perception went straight to the dead grass smell I had always likened to the smell of dead bugs, or cricket dissections. This ensemble of essences triggered memories in a way that made me feel like I was nothing but a collective of fundamental types in different states of flux. Maybe I wasn't going to become those things, but rather had housed all of those archetypes within me all along. I sat up and watched James picking up his spilt bowl of crystals I had accidentally bumped over. I believe it was in one of my jerking movements that I had hit the side of the table and toppled the bowl. I laughed this real hee that triggered the sound of monkeys laughing in my head. I realized that the direction of the essence shifting wasn't random, but went toward whatever I emulated or thought of. Yes, I was the one who could will these archetypes into existence. As if it were some ground-breaking revelation, I thought that I should think of a certain person or archetype from my lifetime to help me come back from this black hole. After I thought about that for a second, every object I looked at seemed to invoke a specifically strong set of feelings, particularly through virtue of their colours. Maybe everything was just made of colours, and colours meant everything. To my right, I could see James's green power growing outside by the back door, and it made me think about the colour green and how it was symbolically like gold. Like green was a sacred commodity, whether in tree or money form. Maybe green was also the way back to myself. Every time I shifted my focus to a green object or word, though, James would get mad at me and tell me to stop talking. Satan wanted to keep me away from his gold. If I focused on the colour blue, though, I would get emotional and feel the water and wind sensations again. I actually felt as if a cold breeze passed over me when I thought back to the inhale and exhale sounds of the wind. Blue was a part of me, yes, but it wasn't letting me out of the hole. I shifted my focus to red, and it made me think of the heart, as well as Knuckles the Echidna, a character from the Sonic the Hedgehog video games. I saw the redness of Knuckles within James, and thought maybe the redness on his face was from the soul he stole from me, and also because he was Satan and Satan's face was red, right? He actually looked a lot like a Satan character, if anyone did. He sported long, pitch-black hair and a moustache goatee. The look in his eyes and the blackness of his pupils made me feel like my soul had been absorbed through them, as if he knew everything about me and thus knew all the best ways to torture me. Torture, treachery, terrorism. They were all T-words associated with pain, I realized. S-words made me think of the feminine for some reason, but it was also a little fishy, serpentine almost. So I realized that each letter of the alphabet had a certain selection of feelings. Thus language was feelings, and feelings were reality. I ended up singing the alphabet song, a pathetic go at triggering the key out of hell once again. I went up to the A's and B's, alpha, beta, apples, B's, but these were still not the right keys back to my old life. Once I stopped this nonsense, I noticed I had also pissed myself on the couch. I had hoped that such a foul act would break the trap I was in. It was then I realized I should probably stop pissing off Satan, or whoever James really was. I had to finally accept the fact of being dead, even though I thought the devil had stolen everything from me, and I was sad that I wasn't going to see any of my loved ones again. I figured I might as well try to honor their memories. I name-dropped many of my friends, and felt each of their essences subsequently roll over me. It was deeply saddening to let go of their essences. One by one, I tried impressions of them, and in some cases, using the accents of their descendants. Then I ended up speaking in tongues, as if I was auditioning celebrity vocal impressions for a TV show. I talked like Stewie from Family Guy, like British comedian Russell Brand, British author Graham Hancock, surfer guys, rappers, myself, and Rashid. Then I thought rather strongly that James might actually be a Jim Morrison reincarnation. Or was it that he was indeed Jim Morrison himself, who had discovered immortality and taken the form of the James I saw before me? It was especially eerie because in some vague logic, it all made sense. If he was Jim Morrison, Then who the hell was I? I was possibly anyone from history's reincarnation, or maybe I had already been everyone else. In fact, between me and Satanic James, both of our souls could have already had been reincarnated as everybody who had ever existed. Perhaps this whole time in the cabin was about confronting the dark parts James and I shared with one another. Perhaps he was the yin portion of our yin-yang, and I was unknowingly the yang, trying to find the balance again. No matter what theory I had, somehow the way James acted confirmed my suspicions. His energy seemed to be all red and black, colours associated with the devil, of course. He wore a black shirt with a graffiti-style graphic of Pac-Man wearing a crown, and I thought, of course, Pac-Man is satanic artwork. It had been right before my very eyes my whole life. His shorts were corduroy and looked identical to ones that I owned and had at home, which reinforced my idea that James had access to everything in my mind and was peppering personalized Easter eggs into his illusion. Equally possible was that James was really the satanic Steverino, the dark aspect of me, destined to force myself through this to learn a lesson. In my exhaustion, I relaxed a bit and had a more pleasant thought that satanic Steverino might actually be trying to unify my Steverino self back to a whole. I just can't wait to find the peace again, I said sadly. I know, Steverino, I know, James replied, matching the energy. My torrent of impressions and searching for essence embodiment keys faded away, so I reckon I started to appear more normal. Are you coming back? It's about time. Thought we lost you there, Steverino, James said, sounding more like the old James. Even though he seemed more like the old James, I felt like he all too casually glossed over the insanity that had just taken place. I felt as though I had begun the process of exiting his geometric dual hex, and that his limited power was likewise in the process of dwindling. I had noticed feelings of being trapped in a triangle as well as a circle earlier in the experience, certainly aspects of the geometric hex I had just suffered. As I came down more and realized that I could quite possibly still be alive, I suddenly lost fear of quote-unquote Satan's games. I understood that I had undergone an ego death surge in the great unknown, but now that I was back in my body, I had an edge over him. It was easy to pat myself on the back for making it that far, but then a thought struck me that I could actually be in the Garden of Eden, and what I had gone through was only the first trial of death. Perhaps I had suffered through the test as a passage into the land of the gods, where the original masters had birthed me. James and I were there together because he was Satan and I was a learning soul of the light, one who needed to prove himself. This could have been an opportunity to switch the incarnations, to have our souls rebirthed again. A more terrifying destiny I came up with was that Satan was going to try and kill me in my sleep so that I would lose my memories and reincarnate as someone else while he enjoyed living as himself forever. That's why he was Satan. He was the one in the never-ending loop, the one who perpetually backstabs the pious other in the Garden of Eden. Surely the Garden of Eden wasn't big enough for the two of us, and James would see to it that I got cast back into a mortal human incarnation, while he awaited the time to have this rodeo all over again. If that were the case, then I reasoned I might be expected to kill him. That is, if I valued eternal life over reincarnation. And if I killed him, he would forget who he was and get reincarnated as a human. The twist would be that I'd become the new Satan as a direct result of killing my friend, out of fear and out of a thirst for power. I'd be allowed my rule over space and time as I awaited the reincarnation of the soul of light to confront me again. It was creative thinking and all, but then it occurred to me that if we both thought of the latter as the situation at hand, we might actually be driven to kill each other, even though I knew I could never bring myself to take a paranoid hunch so seriously that I'd kill anyone. Maybe if I stayed awake all night and then tried to leave in the morning, I'd return to my Garden of Eden version of my family. So I talked about leaving again, as if I was back to square one. James remained firmly against it and dismissed it as a regression to my irrational thinking. Unlike before, though, I decided there was no need to freak out. I'd just hang and keep it cool with Satan for now. He pulled out a green power vessel that was reptilian green, one I hadn't seen before. It was a bit suspicious, but I also thought it'd be cool if in the afterlife limbo, one just consumed as much green power as one wanted. On the bright side, I didn't have to go to college anymore because I was never going to leave the garden. I could hang in the Garden of Eden forever. We finished the green power with ease and walked out to James's garden. We strolled between the crops and talked about simple things like how nice of a day it was and how good the vegetables looked, when I realized that I actually felt quite normal and alive, rather than a dead captive of an ageless magician. The Mycospawn switch had suddenly switched off in my brain, and James was clearly just James. Figuring I had nothing to lose, I came clean about my paranoia and asked him if any of it meant anything, if any of it made sense with respect to the great unknown or his own psyche. I even directly asked him if he was Satan on earth and had orchestrated my delusion to teach me something. He laughed it off immediately and firmly denied being Satan, even though the notion was ridiculous to him, and he shouldn't have had to defend himself against it. Otherwise, I felt as though I had just spiraled through my entire life's psychology in a sensory overload that had lasted 6 hours. I had experienced a classic death and rebirth, as my grasp of reality was practically burned at the cross and resurrected in the cave. James's interpretation was that I had been possessed by a demon. The demon had tricked me into thinking that James was Satan, or simply an other who was in opposition to all that was good, but I'll never be positive about what really happened. It could have plainly been a random consequence of a strong Mycospawn consumption that had opened my mind up to paranoid suggestions. But what exactly were those suggestions then? What is the electrochemical entity that whispers such thoughts of nervousness? Whatever happened, ego death feels like an accurate enough assessment, and it was the most extreme ego death of my life. In some ways, it felt like I was sacrificed to the seasons, partly because I had been listening to the band Yes a lot before. One of their lyrics from their song Survival is "All that dies, dies for reason, to put its strength into the seasons." With the animal noises and elemental sensations I had experienced, the lyrics felt like an all too accurate explanation. Luckily, the experience felt like a packaged religious experience, as if suffering through the devil delusion had earned me some inherent psycho-spiritual merit, some achievement in the video game of life. James and I enjoyed discussion over some green power after we ate dinner that night. Even though I had just experienced a paranoid breakdown, he still decided to tell me what he knew about the Illuminati shape-shifting lizard people conspiracy. It was an interesting theory, no doubt, but not really what I wanted to talk about after having thought he could have been a similar type of creature. My experience had left me less curious about the hidden truths of the world and more excited for living normal life again. Yes, perhaps the most powerful people could be otherworldly entities in disguise, but what good would that do me, trying to prove that? Clearly not much so far. I woke up the next day and took off shortly after breakfast. Of course I was preoccupied the whole way home, half in disbelief that I had actually survived what had just happened. It took me a week or so to stop thinking about the experience. I had been positive that I was dead for several hours. I had gotten used to the thought that I wouldn't ever do simple day-to-day tasks again, but there I was, ready for my first fall semester at Forest University, my next big chapter. Naturally, I had to share the experience with my close friends, and ended up telling it more times than I can count, but I knew I had to let it go before it became all I talked about. I look back on that day as a landmark of transformation, and the day I gained a greater respect for the powers of Mycospawn. There was also a renewed appreciation for life, something I didn't realize I needed. I had lived such a comfortable life my whole upbringing, so maybe I needed to go through a humbling experience of extreme fear, just to feel alive again, to feel thankful to be human. I wrote the bulk of this down right when I returned home from my visit with James. I headed straight up to my bedroom and typed up as many of the details as I could remember, only to have the story's meaning evolve over time in a way I couldn't predict. The summer of Psilocytes was complete, and I had definitely climbed the potency ladder. I was about to meet a lot of like-minded people at Hip Forest, and wasn't going to let one bad trip in the great unknown deter me from further exploration. I could find ways to avoid the delusion, as long as I exercised more caution. There was more wisdom to be had in the great unknown, and I wasn't going to shy away.